So now that we have finalized our plan, updated it based upon our leader's reconnaissance, determined how we are going to sequence events and set conditions, and then utilize TCMs to mitigate friction as we continue through our scheme of maneuver, we are prepared to issue our order to our Marines, during which we are going to inspire our Marines to action and generate confidence in the scheme of maneuver that we have created in order to place them at a position of success as they go out and close with that enemy. So what do you think is different about a platoon level order when compared to the squad level order that you delivered during FEX 1, specific to our scheme of maneuver? Well, with our scheme of maneuver, the answer is nothing. Our scheme of maneuver is still going to contain those same 5 essential elements that you learned during the attack planning process and that you use during your squad attacks during FEX 1. We're still going to brief our Marines on our distribution of forces, form of maneuver, direction of attack, and then walk the dog through the tactical control measures and consolidation. Now, as we're walking the dog, we want to make sure that we are emphasizing the sequence in which our events are organized, and then the conditions that must be set as we move from event to event within our scheme of maneuver. Doing this effectively during our scheme of maneuver as we walk the dog is going to ensure that our Marines are able to effectively visualize the flow of events and the conditions that must be set once they are out executing our plan on the battlefield. Now, there is a difference in how we are going to brief our tasking statements when conducting platoon level operations using fire and maneuver. The first difference is going to be that we are going to use conditions that can be observed on the battlefield for that win portion of our tasking statements. And then the second difference is that we are now going to brief our tasks in the order that they are going to occur during our scheme of maneuver. So previously, you likely briefed your task first fire team, second fire team, third fire team, regardless of how the events unfolded or the order of events during our scheme of maneuver. But now we are going to brief our tasks as they occur, likely beginning with that support by fire elements task, and then tasking our maneuver element, who's going to close after the support by fire element has achieved that condition that we need to set on the deck in order to allow the maneuver element to close. So an example of how we can do this is that we can begin with our support by fire tasking statement, which would sound something like this. Third squad, you are supporting effort 1. Upon effective indirect fire suppression, which is that condition that we have decided needs to be set on the deck, support by fire on company objective alpha in order to allow second squad to destroy the CRF platoon on the objective. Upon the destruction of the CRF platoon, displace by unit to link up point 1 via the most direct route. So as you can see here, we have taken that win portion of our tasking statement, and instead of having something such as on order or on signal, we have put in the condition that must exist on the deck in order for them to allow them to accomplish their attack in that place. Once again, facilitating that decentralized decision making for that subordinate unit leader. And then at the end of the tasking statement, we attach that MORT statement that we discussed during the first portion of our platform that's going to provide instructions on how the support by fire element is going to conduct link up with our platoon on the objective. Now let's take a look at what a tasking statement might sound like for a maneuver element as we're conducting fire and maneuver. It could sound something like this. Second squad, you are the main effort. Upon effective direct fire suppression from third squad, once again, that condition on the battlefield that can be observed and that must exist before they can then conduct their task, destroy the CRF platoon on company objective alpha in order to allow the battalion to continue their attack north. So now that we have talked about some differences in how we're going to issue our order, as well as some things that are going to remain the same, and we have now issued our order to our Marines, ensuring that they understand our sequence of events, the conditions that must exist as we flow from one event to the next, and then we have tied those conditions into the tasking statements that we provide our Marines. We can now move on to the most important troop leading step, which is to supervise, during which time we are going to take ownership of our scheme of maneuver from start to finish. During this phase, we need to ensure that we rehearse our scheme of maneuver. As you know, if you've attempted an attack using support fire and maneuver previously, and as you will discover as we continue through our Platoon Pure package, it takes significant coordination in order to successfully conduct an attack using the technique of fire and maneuver. And so in order to do this successfully, we must rehearse our plan until we can't get it wrong. Some other things that we're going to do during this phase are conduct those pre-combat checks and pre-combat inspections, just as you did during your squad level package. Now, these are largely going to be the responsibility of the squad leader, who is going to supervise the detailed conduct of those PCCs and PCIs. But at the end of the day, you as the platoon commander are responsible for anything your platoon does or fails to do, which means you still need to be intimately involved in the conduct of PCCs and PCIs as your squad leaders are executing them with their individual squads. And a method that we can use to do this is by pulling the pre-combat check and pre-combat inspection checklist that is going to be listed in the appendix of the Marine Infantry Platoon publication. This checklist is going to provide you with a definitive checklist that is going to serve as a baseline to ensure that we hit all of the essential wickets for our pre-combat checks and pre-combat inspections. So now that we have completed the preparation phase, we have used our 6 troop leading steps to frame our planning process. We are ready to move on to the conduct phase of our operation, where we are going to execute the scheme of maneuver or the plan that you have created. Now, before we actually begin our attack, we first need to talk about the types of cover that can be used in order to facilitate our movement as we close with the objective. Now, there are 2 types of cover that we can use to facilitate our closure. The first is going to be cover by terrain. Cover by terrain is where we are going to use micro or macro terrain in order to shield us from the effects of enemy fire as well as from enemy observation. And this can range anywhere from an individual Marine as they conduct fire and movement using a piece of micro terrain to provide them cover as they're in that 4 position suppressing the enemy, to an entire platoon using a hill to move behind in order to prevent the enemy from observing them as they conduct their movement and to prevent the enemy from massing their fires on that platoon. Now, if we can't use terrain in order to provide us cover as we move, then we're going to need to use the second type of cover, which is going to be cover by fire, during which we are going to use suppression of an adjacent unit to suppress the enemy in order to allow us to move. And once again, this can be scaled across the entire spectrum of Marine Corps operations, from the buddy pair where the Marine in the 4 position is suppressing the enemy in order to provide cover for the Marine in that aft position as they assess, reload, employ an HE asset, look to their unit leader, and then move. Or we can use it all the way up to the platoon, company, and battalion level as one unit suppresses the enemy in order to allow that other unit to maneuver to a position of advantage and then close with the enemy position. Now, as we conduct our movement to the objective, we are primarily going to use cover by terrain, moving between TCMs to the assault position, still using those considerations regarding formations and route planning that you use during PECs, ensuring that we're planning a route that maximizes the use of terrain to provide us security, while also planning our formations based upon our need for speed as well as security during that movement. Thinking about the trade-off between speed and control versus security and sustainability, which is going to drive things like whether we're going to use a platoon tactical column, deciding that we need more speed and maybe slightly less security, or maybe we determine that the enemy situation is more likely for us to take contact. So we're going to move into that platoon wedge, sacrificing some of that speed and control, but gaining maybe a little bit of security as we conduct that movement. Now, as we move into our actions on the objective, our primary fire is now going to become cover by fire as we are exposing ourselves to the enemy in order to close. And as we conduct that closure and we use that cover by fire, we are going to continue to use the cycle of the infantrymen as a framework to allow us to understand how we are going to conduct that closure. Continuing to use the steps of suppress, assess, move, and kill in order to allow us to close with the enemy position. It's important to understand that the cycle of the infantrymen isn't just something that applies to the buddy pair as they're conducting firing movement. This framework can be used as we conduct platoon, squad, company, and battalion level operations in order to give us a framework within which we can think about the cycle for suppressing the enemy in order to allow us to move and then ultimately kill the enemy and accomplish our mission. So let's begin with the first step, suppress. There are multiple different ways that we can suppress the enemy and multiple different assets that we can use as we continue through our scheme of maneuver. We can begin by using that indirect fire suppression in order to allow us to move from our cold to our hot position and then begin our direct fire suppression on the objective. From there, we can try to achieve that overlap in between indirect and direct fire suppression, beginning our direct fire suppression from support by fire and then continuing it for as long as possible in order to allow our maneuver element to then move out from their cover by terrain in the assault position to now closing with the enemy, exposing themselves to that enemy because they've got cover from our fires as they continue to close. And then as the maneuver element closes and the support by fire element must their fires in order to prevent fratricide, the maneuver element is going to establish their own internal base of fire, still using that good fire and movement that you learned during your squad level tactics in order to assume responsibility for suppression and continue to suppress the enemy and have that fire by cover as they close. Now, once we have suppressed the enemy, we can't immediately begin to move. We must first assess the effects of our suppression because only effective fires enable movement. And then this goes back to that concept of establishing conditions that are observable on the deck in order to allow us to transition between events. It is during this step of assessing that we are visually observing the conditions that exist in order to assess the effects of our suppression, assess whether that condition has been met in order to allow that decision maker to decide if we are ready to move on to our next event. Now, in order for us to be able to do this, all of these effects must be able to be visually observed by a decision maker. And then we, as commanders and decision makers, need to place ourselves in a position to observe those effects. It's not enough to just hear indirect fire landing in the vicinity of the objective or to hear our support by fire element firing. We need to visually observe those impacts to ensure that they are accurate and that they are achieving the effect that we want them to gain before we can move on to the next step within our scheme of maneuver. In order to do this, we have 4 principles of effective suppression that we can use to gauge whether or not we have achieved effective suppression on the enemy and we have set conditions to transition between events within our scheme of maneuver. Those 4 principles are accuracy, distribution of fires, weapon to target match, and rates of fire. Accuracy is pretty basic. It's, are we hitting what we need to be hitting? Are we hitting the target at which we're firing? Distribution of fires refers to how we are spreading our fires across the objective in order to suppress as much of that enemy as possible. Are we effectively suppressing the entire enemy position, or are we only suppressing one machine gun bunker or one enemy foxhole, allowing the rest of that enemy position to reorient and mass their fires on the maneuver element? For weapon to target match, this is referring to how are we employing our individual assets in order to ensure we are maximizing the effect of those assets and effectively suppressing the enemy by using the different assets that we have available to us as a platoon. So, for example, if we are trying to suppress an enemy machine gun bunker, it may not be the most effective means of suppressing that bunker by using our individual M16s. Instead, we may seek to use some sort of HE asset, such as our 203s, in order to suppress or destroy that position. Or we may seek to mass our fires on that critical weapon system using our automatic weapons, that M27 IAR, in order to make sure that we are appropriately matching the weapon that we are using to gain the effect that we need upon that enemy position. And then finally, we can look at rates of fire, which refers to how much suppression or how rapidly are we firing at that enemy in order to achieve the effect that we want to achieve. So in order to distribute our fires effectively, we're going to once again use those target reference points that we discussed during the first portion of the platform. Now, just a refresher, TRPs are going to be those easily identifiable terrain features or items on the deck that allow us to rapidly correlate the support by fire element to the areas that we need them to suppress. And TRPs are not necessarily going to be targets. They can be things like a dead tree that's on the ground, or a specific tree that's easy to identify, or it can be an enemy position. But the key here is that they are reference points, and we are going to be suppressing the enemy in between those TRPs by just focusing all of our fires on that one individual target reference point. And by using TRPs to control our fires, we can ensure that we are distributing our fires across the objective while also giving us a tool to rapidly shift and cease those fires or orient those fires in the area that we need them to be to achieve the effect that we are seeking to gain. And then lastly, we are going to tie our MSLs to those TRPs in order to allow us to determine at what point we need to shift or cease our fires to prevent fratricide. So for our example here, as we discussed earlier, we've got our support by fire element located on the terrain feature to the south of the bridge and the maneuver element in their assault position. As that support by fire element reaches their hot position, they are going to establish their 3 target reference points, the same as we had established earlier. Now, from those target reference points, just as we discussed during the first portion of the platform, they're going to identify the TRP that is going to be closest to the maneuver element. And then from that, they're going to pull an azimuth and then establish their 45 or 15-degree offset based upon whatever weapon system that they are using in order to allow them to establish their minimum safe line, here referred to as MSL1. They're then going to determine as they shift their fires to that next portion of the objective where their second MSL will be. Once they do that and maneuver closes, they'll begin their suppression. As maneuver crosses MSL1, they'll shift fires. And then as the maneuver crosses MSL2, they're going to cease those fires in order to allow the maneuver element to continue to close. So let's take a look at that one more time to ensure that we understand how we're going to execute this once we're out in the tree line. So first, we establish those TRPs. We know that we're going to begin by suppressing in between TRPs 1 and 2. From there, we establish our MSL based upon TRP 1. And then we know that when the maneuver element crosses MSL 1, we're going to shift our fires to in between TRPs 2 and 3. Therefore, for our second MSL, we'll use TRP 2, get that good 45 or 15-degree offset, and establish MSL 2. Now that we've established our MSLs, the maneuver element can begin to close, and we can begin our suppression in between TRPs 1 and 2 until maneuver element crosses MSL 1, at which point we will shift our fires to in between 2 and 3, and then as the maneuver element crosses MSL 2, we will cease those fires in order to allow the maneuver element to continue to close and destroy that enemy, accomplishing the mission and clearing the objective. So the second element of allowing us to assess effective suppression is going to be those rates of fire that we discussed previously. And there are 2 categories that we use to discuss rates of fire. The first is going to be the sustained rate. And this is going to be that like average suppression We're going to use it in order to conserve ammunition and to really maintain the level of suppression that we have already established. This is going to be our default rate of fire. So we're going to use this unless some condition on the deck determines or signals to us that we need to increase our suppression to a higher rate. Now, if we decide that we need to increase our suppression to a higher rate based upon the conditions that exist in the battle space for the maneuver element, then we can transition to the rapid rate. Now, at the rapid rate, we're going to be providing a much heavier level of suppression for the maneuver element, but we're going to trade this heavy level of suppression for our higher rate of ammunition consumption, meaning that we would be able to suppress for a shorter period of time at the rapid rate than we would be able to when suppressing at the sustained rate. And the employment of the rapid rate is going to be based upon the effects that we observe on the deck. So what are some of those effects? Well, the first may be as the maneuver element first begins to move from the assault position and closes with the enemy, we may desire to start with that opening rate of fire at the rapid rate to establish that level of suppression that we need in order to close. Once we've established that high volume of fire, we can then, once we've determined that we have gained effective suppression, transition back to that sustained rate in order to conserve some ammunition while still maintaining the level of suppression that we have gained through that high initial volley of fire. And then as the maneuver element closes, if we observe that they are slowing because of the effects of enemy fire, well, then we may desire to go back to the rapid rate in order to aid the maneuver element as they continue their closure. And then finally, as the maneuver element approaches that minimum safe line on the deck, we may want to increase our rate of fire again, because once the maneuver element crosses the MSL, we're going to have to cease or shift our fires, meaning the maneuver element is going to have to assume some additional responsibility for their own suppression. So by increasing our rate of fire as they cross that MSL, we are aiding them to establish that base of fire before we are forced to cease or shift our fires. So once we have effectively suppressed the enemy and then assessed the effects of our suppression using those 4 criteria previously discussed, we can now move and close with that enemy position. Once we have effective suppression, we must violently close. The Marine Corps Infantry Platoon publication states that fires without maneuver do not provide decisive results, and that attempting to maneuver without fires invites destruction or failure. Or to put this in other terms, fires without maneuver are just a waste of ammunition. We're not accomplishing anything other than suppressing the enemy, which is not going to lead to that decisive result that we are seeking. But maneuver without fires is suicide, because we are now going to expose ourselves to the enemy without the cover that is needed in order for to allow us to close. But because suppression isn't free and it is not going to last forever, once we have gained effective suppression, we now need to rapidly close with that enemy position using that fire and movement as the maneuver element in order to ensure that we are prepared to assume our own internal base of fire, to assume responsibility for that suppression as we continue to close with the enemy. And then once we've closed with the enemy and we have reached the objective, we can kill the enemy, clear through the objective, and then move on to our final step, which is going to be that consolidation. Consolidation for platoon level operations is going to look much like it did for consolidation as you conducted squad operations during FEX 1. We're going to begin by going through that safe process, establishing security, assigning those sectors of fire, placing our critical weapon systems, those automatic weapons, along avenues of approach, and then clearing our individual fields of fire to ensure that we are able to defend our position, and then possibly even entrenching on the objective, depending on how long we believe we are going to stay in place. After we've completed the safe process, we can then move on to getting those ACE reports. and then submit our report to hire in the form of a sit rep, during which, once again, we are going to focus on providing our company with the information that they need, which is really going to be whether or not our platoon is combat effective or ineffective, and whether or not we are able or unable to conduct follow-on operations, making that decision based upon the level of sustainment or ammunition that we have remaining, or based on the number of casualties that we may have assumed during the assault. So now that we have moved through our preparation phase using the 6 troop leading steps to guide our planning process, and then we have discussed the conduct phase and how we can use cover, both cover by terrain and cover by fire, in order to facilitate movement, and then use the cycle of the infantryman to frame our thought process as we are using cover by fire to close with the objective. And then discussed how we are going to consolidate on the objective using that safe process to establish our hasty 180, and then transitioning into pushing up those ACE reports to determine whether or not we are ready to conduct follow-on operations. We are now ready to execute our scheme of maneuver and see how all of this is going to tie together in order to allow us to accomplish our mission of destroying the squad on Company Objective Alpha. So here you have your platoon located in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, moving up to the squad release point. Once they reach the squad release point, that support by fire element is going to break off, conducting their independent movement to phase line green, while the maneuver element moves up to phase line blue. Now, as previously discussed, in order to set the appropriate conditions needed in order to cross phase line green, we need to establish some level of suppression on the enemy so that they cannot affect the support by fire element as they move from cold to hot across the MSR, across that phase line, and occupy their support by fire position. So we'll begin suppressing the enemy with indirect fire to facilitate our movement across the phase line and to allow us to occupy our support by fire and begin suppression. We're then going to suppress the enemy as the maneuver element closes, hitting MSL1, at which time we're going to shift our fires. And then as the enemy continues to close, hitting MSL2, we will cease our fires as the maneuver element then closes, clearing through the objective and destroying that enemy. They will then hit their limit of advance, at which time you saw they popped smoke, signaling to our support by fire element that they can displace via that MORT statement, pushing to the link up point and making link up with the rest of the platoon, setting conditions to continue on into our consolidation, at which time we are then going to work through our safe process, pull our ACE reports, and then contact our company to let them know that we are standing by to conduct follow-on operations. So today, in order to prepare you with the skills and concepts needed to be successful, we've begun by discussing the 2 types of attack, being that hasty and deliberate attack that you can conduct as a rifle platoon in the offense. From there, we took a look at the 6 forms of maneuver, focusing on the 2 that you will conduct here at the basic school. We then took a deep dive looking at some support by fire considerations that are going to allow us to effectively employ our support by fire element based upon those principles of TED and TING in order to support the maneuver element as they close, establishing TRPs and MSLs in order to allow us to shift and cease our fires and prevent fratricide while also providing the necessary suppression to support our maneuver element. From there, we used BAMSIS to frame our planning process, discussing how we can appropriately sequence events and set conditions as we continue on and transition through our scheme of maneuver. And then we talked about how we can gain some control over the battle space within our preparation, conduct, and consolidation phases. All of these things that we have discussed today are going to serve as a blueprint for action for you as you push out into the tree line to conduct your platoon level attacks during FEX 2. And more importantly, as you leave the basic school, continue on to your MOS school, and then in just a few short months, stand in front of Marines, leading that platoon of Marines, possibly in combat as you seek to accomplish your mission. I am confident that with the skills and concepts that we have discussed today, that you will be prepared to do just that. to stand in front of your platoon of Marines and confidently lead them to accomplish whatever mission you have been assigned, placing your Marines at a position of advantage to accomplish that mission. My name is Captain Rogers. I work in the bullpen, and my contact information is listed here on the screen. If you have any questions about platoon level offensive operations, anything that we have discussed today, or anything relating to platoon pure operations in general, please come by the bullpen or shoot me an email, and I would be happy to discuss those questions with you.